Michèle, I want to start with you because you were on the short list of candidates for Secretary of Defense this last time around. Your name constantly comes up as the potential first female Secretary of Defense. You said no, and I was wondering, is that because the world is such a mess right now?
No, I actually was born with the public service gene, and it pained me to say not at this time because, but I had issue with a young child who was very ill at the time. Good news is he's 100% and he's healthy again, but at the time, it's not the time to take on that kind of job. But the world, I think this president and the next president are going to have a very daunting national security inheritance. And
Fran, you were home with a 2-year-old when 9/11 happened.
2-week.
I'm sorry, 2-week-old. What did I say? 2-year-old, 2-week-old. And you lost a dear friend, FBI official, in the wreckage of the World Trade Center. And then you went on to advise the president on counterterrorist strategy. When you look at that period compared to right now, are we safer or less safe?
So the good news is we have capabilities in place that we had to build over the course of 2 administrations, frankly. And so we are safer in that sense. We're also safer in the sense that the al-Qaeda core, the bin Laden core al-Qaeda is much diminished. And so what we worry about today are sort of the Garland, Texas type attacks. They recruit online, they get somebody who has access to weapons to pull off an attack, but you're talking about lower fatalities, smaller types of attacks. The world is a dangerous place, though, and so I think it's, in some respects, a more dangerous place, even though we have greater capability.
And more dangerous, we were talking about this before. I mean, the great fear in Syria, of course, which has become an area where 2 superpowers are operating, the great fear is an accidental interaction between Russia and the U.S. Is that a possibility?
Well, we've seen Russian incursions into Turkish airspace multiple times now. We've seen the problems with deconfliction, U.S. pilots and Russian pilots now in the air. And so what you worry about is a superpower miscalculation. I don't think anybody wants that sort of a conflict. But at no time since the Cuban Missile Crisis has there been a greater risk, in my judgment, of a miscalculation by superpowers that causes a confrontation.
What do you think of that, Michèle?
I think it is a very real risk. What you've seen is the reemergence of real tension with Russia. Not in that we're going back to the Cold War, but you have Russia basically going into Syria to prop up the Assad regime. Let's be clear about what they're doing. They're not fighting ISIS as much as they're propping up Assad. They're trying to keep their strategic toehold in the Middle East, their warm water port, and they're trying to put forces on the ground that will give them cards to play if and when there's finally a negotiation for what comes after Assad. But in the meantime, they're not coordinating. They're not really interested in even deconfliction, right. And they're taking a real risk that an accident could occur and that could escalate.
If you were Secretary of Defense or on the national security team, what would your policy towards Syria be?
I think at this point, there aren't many good options for the United States. I think we had better options 3 or 4 years ago. But at this point, I do
Would you have supported vetting and arming rebels?
Earlier, I think when there were viable groups to support, yes.
Back in 2012, when Secretary Clinton and Leon Panetti supported?
I would have leaned forward and done more. But I think now, sort of airdropping supplies and weapons to those who are successfully engaging the regime and ISIS, I think that's a good thing. But I think now is a moment with Russia's intervention to really pull the coalition back together and try to get on the same page. Because the truth is, we need to be much more united in how we're approaching this. We have this grand coalition, but too many people are acting independently and not really working towards that end game, which is a transition for Assad and some kind of negotiated solution. In the meantime, we should also be doing much more in terms of humanitarian assistance, trying to provide protection to the internally displaced people, as well as shoring up all of the states in the region who have taken on these refugees. If you think about Jordan, the proportion of refugees Jordan has taken in, it's like the United States absorbing the entire population of Canada. That's how overwhelming it is for Jordan right now.
So, you know, it's interesting, there's a question of being skeptical about intervention, but then there's also weak leadership. I mean, which one are we in?
I mean, we have to be clear about our interests. I don't believe we have vital interests at stake in Syria. I don't know if Fran disagrees with that, but we do have interests, and we do care about how this comes out. And I think the key is to calibrate our response. But that, you know, the fact is, you can lead, and you can lead a coalition without, you know, an overwhelming military intervention. That is not the only tool in the toolbox. We have many other tools that we can use. Again, fewer and less effective than maybe we had 3 or 4 years ago, but we still have tools, and leadership is the key.
So this administration is not showing enough muscular leadership in the region?
I would like to see more of a strategic approach, not only in Syria, but for the region as a whole, that really, you know, tries to safeguard our interests over the longer term, and then put the eaches of the crises in that context.
Fran, same question to you. What would you do if you were on the national security team? What would you advise on Syria?
So I mean, I don't disagree with what Michèle has said. I will say I think there's been a real sorry lack of leadership. And what that results in is you're seeing airdrops of weapons to people we believe are fighting both, but of course when you drop them, you lose control of them. Because we're not coordinating and pulling together this coalition, you've got the Saudis, the Qataris, and the Emiratis all sending different kinds of arms to different sorts of groups. There's a historical precedent in Afghanistan. Remember, those weapons, those Stinger missiles, were then turned against the West. Yeah. And so this is a very dangerous, what they're doing now is a sort of an interim policy, is a very dangerous thing that has potential repercussions. I agree we've got to sort of shore up those who are housing the refugees. I mean, when we talk about our interests, I think it's right we don't have vital national interest there, but let's be clear. There is a genocide taking place in Syria. 250,000 Syrians have been killed. You've got the largest refugee crisis, including displaced persons, since World War II. I wrote an article that was published on foreignpolicy.com yesterday. I think we have a national interest in taking refugees into this country. I've proposed a bunch of ways that you can vet them and vet them better than we have with the Iraqis. I think our Arab partners have access to databases that will help us do vetting. And if you don't take these young people in, one, you've got a lost generation because they're not being educated, they don't have access to medical help and housing. Some don't even have access to water. And if you don't begin to take some refugees in, you have this lost generation that are angry and alienated that wind up to be the recruiting pool for the Al-Qaeda, ISIS, or the next extremist group. Yeah,
and Michèle, I wanted to get your opinion on that. I read that I think 67% of the Syrian refugees going into Europe are young men. What would you do about that?
Again, I think the EU and the United States, we need to show much more leadership in terms of bringing in our fair share of the refugees, but also I would support more humanitarian assistance in the region and even providing some safe zones and corridors to get more assistance to the population that's stuck inside the country.
So, Fran, the whole Syrian conflict with Russia engaged has sort of overshadowed that threat, ISIS. Talk about how much of a threat it poses to us now, and also internally. How protected are we from homegrown jihadists, ISIS-style jihadists?
So the good news, as I said earlier, is we have capability we didn't have at 9/11. We shored up border security. We have better coordination between the FBI and the CIA to stop people from entering. It's not perfect, very difficult to track foreign fighters who have been in that fight, bled out into Europe, who are trying to get into the United States. So it's risky. But of course, what the jihadists of ISIS has found is they don't have to cross a border. They have the internet, they have social media, they can recruit, they can inspire, acts like Garland, Texas. And so I worry about both the homegrown, the recruitment. FBI has made 60 arrests in the last 18 months, ISIS-related here inside the U.S.
That's astonishing. I don't think that number has sunk in with people. 60
they have
arrests.
In all 50 states.
In all 50 states.
And
every single state?
Well, they have investigations right now in every single state of the United States. And so that is a drain on their resources. You can't cover every single lead, and you make judgments about where you're going to put those investigative resources, and sometimes you make a mistake. So the Garland Texans guys come up on your radar, but you've got to pull surveillance. You know, so we're at risk for that sort of a small-scale attack inside the United States inspired by ISIS, for sure.
So, Michelle, in a short time we have left, one thing we haven't talked about is China and the militarization going on in the South China Sea, where there's, I think they've built a runway that's big enough to land a U.S. space shuttle. Should we be worried about China as a military player?
Based on their actions, I think the jury's out, but I think it's quickly coming towards a conclusion that yes, we need to worry. They have made tremendous investments in the modernization of their military, investing particularly in weapon systems that will try to deny our access in the region and our freedom of movement. So they seem to be, trying to focus on that. In addition, they are creating islands out of rocks and reefs, not in accordance with international law, in disputed areas that they don't have sovereignty over. And they're really trying to kind of create new facts on the ground in a unilateral way. And I think our traditional role as underwriting the international rules of the road that have given Asia tremendous prosperity and tremendous stability in the last several decades, I think that's going to be contested in the future. And that is an area of vital interest for us. And we need to be making the investments today and tomorrow to make sure that we can maintain that freedom of action and play that stabilizing role.
So as we wrap this up, I want to ask each of you the 3 top countries we should worry about. I mean, let's throw out, we haven't talked about Iran yet, and North Korea and so forth, but give me your 3 or 4 top countries that worry you the most, Fran.
So Syria and Iran, I put them together, Russia, and I worry about Saudi Arabia. We do have vital national interests in Saudi Arabia. They've had the stampede in Mecca. Their custodianship of the 2 holy sites has been brought into question. There is a regional struggle between the Saudis and the Iranians, and they also are suffering from a threat to their right, if you will, in terms of the religious spectrum from ISIS. So they have internal terrorism threats. And they've just been through a succession. They then changed the line of succession several months later. There's a sense of fragility about the kingdom that we haven't seen before. And so
you think it could
Syria,
fall?
Iran,
You think the House of
No,
Saud
I think that's overestimated. I do not believe the House of Saud is.
What would happen in Saudi Arabia?
Well, but you'll see the rise from 2003 to 2005. There were multiple bombings and terror threats, and in fact, the now Crown Prince was targeted for assassination years later because of his efforts against terror. I think you run the risk of seeing the rise of terror again. They know how to fight it, but I think that they're particularly vulnerable right now.
Michelle, your top 3 or 4?
Well, in addition to Russia, the sort of chaos in the Middle East that could destabilize others and then would touch on our vital interests, and the rise of a China that may not play by the rules. I'd like to add something that's not a country, which is the absence of a budget deal that gives us the ability to invest in the tools, diplomatic, economic, and defense, that we are going to need to be able to deal effectively with the future that's
And I did want to give you an opportunity to talk just real briefly about how you see the need for business to re-engage, Silicon Valley to re-engage with defense.
Yeah. So it used to be that innovation was driven for the military by investment in defense research and development, government investment. Now, the top defense firms, what they spend on research and development is absolutely dwarfed by companies like Google and Facebook and others. The cutting edge is no longer in DoD labs. It's out there in commercial firms in Silicon Valley. And yet post-Snowden, there's been a tremendous breach of trust. We need to bridge that gap. We need to be having a civil-military dialogue that particularly with the technological cutting edge, if you will, and figure out how we can appropriately leverage some of that technology to ensure our national security going forward.
It's a national security issue.
It is.
Thank you so much, Michelle. Fran, thank you for being here.
Thank you.